Beautiful, beautiful. So, morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time zone you're in and dialing in from, welcome to this Global Chats. This unbelievably is something like our seventh. So pleased to have Layne here with us from Google, talking all things design thinking and more. With her svelte top on, so we're ready for that tactile moment a bit later. And myself and Corey are your hosts for today's show. So I'm Mark Watkins, VP of Sales and Delivery for Adeption here in New Zealand and across Australia. And Corey is my equivalent over in the US. Corey, say hi to the folks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Corey Criswell, Chief Leadership Officer, Americas for Adeption, and I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Beautiful. I'm Waiuku, and of course we're going to be hearing a lot from Layne later, so feel free to wave at this point because you're going to be talking for the whole rest of it, and say hi.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. I am calling in today from Portland, Oregon, and so thrilled to be here and spend this time. And hope that you've also brought questions as well so that you don't just listen to me talking the whole hour.
It's a beautiful trigger, as I often say, and many of you will be bored of now. Best form of memory comes in a pen. So grab a pen, make some notes, capture any questions as they arise for you. Feel free to pop them in the chat or hold them to unmute yourself later and share with Layne and myself and Corey. What we'll do is just get us technologically savvy, juiced up this morning by having access to the Menti poll, just to see how on point you guys are. So bear with me as I pull that up, pop it into present mode, and just have a little crack there, either going old school and typing it in on a separate screen or scan away with your mobile phones via the QR code. It will take you straight in and just allow yourself to give a thumbs up when you've arrived so that we know that you're here. And then we can just find out where everyone's dialing in from and get you rocking and rolling with a feeling-esque question. Looks like we have a tech-savvy group. We've got 5, 6, 7, 8, all connecting in, 9. Woo, the numbers are going up. Awesome. Keep that rolling. And here's the nice and relatively simple remembering where you're from. I've already populated my little blue dot just outside of Auckland in a place called Waiuku. Where are you dialing in from in the world? Blue dots are plenty. Nicely done as people are still signing in and connecting in there. Now, given today's all about the beauty of well-designed experiences, products, services, we thought we'd get you to connect personally with, so what does it feel like to have a really well-designed service, product, or app? How does it make you feel? You got up to 3 feeling responses to capture. So think of something that's really beautifully designed for you. What would be the words, the feeling words that come to mind when it's fit for purpose? Beautiful. And then just have a look at the nice population coming up on the screen as we go. Yeah, engaging, seamless, magical. If only it could be our lived experience for all things, all services, and all engagements. It's what we aspire to at Adeption, but it's an aspiration like everything else. I'm going to stop sharing the screen as those continue to come in and move in for some key connect-ins, framing for today's session with Corey and getting us rocking and rolling. So over to you, Corey.
Wonderful. Thank you. What really stood out to me about those Menti results was the word engaged. I love that. Just the thought of how ready people are to interact with something just from the design of it, even before they get into it. So purpose of our time together is to spend time with Layne and get to know a little bit more about her. And to do that, we're going to start with some rapid fire questions, Layne. So the first one is, what do you love best about your work?
Oh, I approach this work of people development, leadership development really as an anthropologist, and not because I'm a trained anthropologist, but curiosity about like, okay, why do we believe what we believe? Why do we operate and behave the way that we do? How might we design better ways to operate together in service of what we're, trying to accomplish? So that is something that just continuously engages me in this work because, humans are complex and beautiful beings. And so I never get bored with that idea.
If you weren't doing this type of work, what would you be doing?
I would be writing nonfiction. I'm sorry, fiction. I'd be writing novels. Or I would be an interior designer.
I can see both of those for you. Something not on your resume.
Oh, my love language is ice cream.
Jenny's, right?
Jenny's is certainly a favorite, but I do not play favorites. I will eat any ice cream anytime.
Excellent.
Probably to my cholesterol levels challenge.
What about a nickname you were known by and where it originated?
It's not too complicated. My younger sister, she's about 2 years younger than me, just always called me L. So my first initial, essentially.
What's your newest go-to app on your phone?
Well, newest is an app called Starwalk. And for anyone who likes constellations in the night sky, it's one of many options out there, but I've been having a lot of fun just using it at night and kind of noticing like which planets are visible, which satellites are going overhead right now.
What are you reading or listening to right now?
I just started listening to a podcast called When You're Invisible. And it's really about sort of the unsung, maybe unappreciated. So instead of, highlighting people who are rich and famous and, so many podcasts are focused on maybe the people who are already known, it's talking to everyday people who oftentimes don't have their stories highlighted. And I'm really just enjoying the broad range and sort of diversity of folks that are featured on it.
Oh, I love that. I've never heard of that. And then finally, what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning?
Two things immediately jump to mind. First one, coffee. Second one is just, and I love that some of these words came up actually in the mentee poll we just did, is I think this work, when when done really well, it's an opportunity to make sure people feel seen and heard. And so that is definitely something that motivates me every day, is figuring out like, how do we help more people feel seen and heard through the work that we do? Never ever get bored with that.
Well, that's a great lead in to just setting the stage about what we're here to talk about. So we're really excited to have you join us, Layne, talking about empowerment through empathy and lessons from human-centered design. So how to leverage a problem-solving technique that puts real people at the center of the development process. When you and I worked together at Target, that is a strength of yours. I learned a lot from you about human-centered design. So here's the question for you. Why is this topic important, and why have you chosen to devote so much of your time to this area?
That is $1 million question. What I'd say is a couple things come to mind immediately. First of all, I mentioned I deeply love this work, and earlier in my career, I was someone who got a lot of satisfaction out of being the expert with a capital E, and sort of being presented maybe with a business challenge and needing to come up with a solution. And I kind of quickly realized like there was a finite amount of growth for me personally if I was going to continue to kind of hold this perspective of like, well, I'm the expert and I know what people need. But I really, quite honestly, almost accidentally stumbled into doing design thinking or human-centered design as a way to create learning and development or leadership development solutions. And in that process, just remembered how much fun it is to be wrong. Remembered how much it's enjoyable to have a beginner's mindset, to really look at a challenge with fresh eyes every time, because you're actually, leaning into the process of talking to ultimately the user of that product or program, or some cases it's a resource. In those conversations with them, being able to really center the humans who need the thing became a really joyful endeavor and helped me continue to be in sort of that beginner's mindset, like growth mindset all the time doing this work versus, frankly, sometimes when you've done a certain type of work for a long time, it's really easy to be in a comfort zone and lose that edge.
What really stood out to me about that, Layne, was I don't feel like we hear many people say, like, I enjoy being wrong. That does take
I
quite a
didn't
bit
always.
right. No, I appreciate that. That stood out to me. So let me hand back to Mark to bring us to our next Menti poll.
There you go. So just thinking about your own experience of developing a program, service, or solution, and this is a strongly disagree to strongly agree. Just take each one of those specific statements and think for yourself, where do you sit on that spectrum? Cool. These are still coming in and varying up and down as we go. I love that about the live polls. You're about to make a statement and then you realize it's changed. So we'll pause there for your reflections, Corey, Layne, as those final numbers come in. Just see what stands out to you, what resonates, any other things that get provoked or triggered in your thinking as you look at the results there from the team here.
Yeah, one thing I'm really curious about is it looks like this group is skewing closer to the strongly agree end of the spectrum, and so it also makes me think about if these questions, in some ways, if we were also framing them to say, and how often might the cultures, the environments, the collaborators we need to work with, are they excited about us doing these things or not? Sometimes that's a particular challenge in doing this work, is getting the air cover to take the time to talk to the end users or to really deeply understand the problem, et cetera.
The other thing that stands out to me is this: I consistently take time to test and iterate. I'm curious, I'd love to see in chat, what are the reasons that you don't? Is it time pressure? Is it exactly what Layne's saying? Don't have organizational buy-in and support to test and iterate? I'm curious about that one. Mark, what stands out to you about these results?
Yeah, I had the same around the test and iterate, because there's that first phase of deep diagnostic that if you're already in the mindset of deep empathy and I need to understand what's important to the audience, then it's a go-to, it's a have to. But then in order to really refine it, just thinking about this Menti poll, it changes and varies over time. And so where the audience is at will evolve through a program and even through testing. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know. And so it's only through the prototype that they realize, well, I thought I wanted that, but I realize now that I don't. Maybe this is more where we need to focus. And so that iteration is critical if you want to keep design thinking live with a complete focus on the audience in mind throughout.
Mark, I love that reflection. And what it sparked for me is also, sometimes in the effort of doing this work and doing testing and prototyping, we might assume we have to. I'll use myself as an example. At one point, it was like, well, if we can't test it with 100 people, that's not valid, right? And so I think sometimes there's also like the creative application in the moment to say, okay, we can't get 100 people, maybe we can't get a statistically significant amount of people to test it. But what we can do is do some lighter testing with a couple different groups and maybe have a control group and see what we learn in that process. So prototyping in particular, I think, is an opportunity to get really creative.
The other thought that came to mind was heard a client recently suggest, let's test it with the HR team before we roll it out to the audience. And it's like, well, the HR team have their own set of paradigms, principles, understandings, and they never quite behave in a room how I've ever experienced an audience group behave. Can we test it with the actual people doing the program, please? Because otherwise it really isn't valid. To your point about numbers, it's also who you pick for the testing.
Absolutely.
I love that. I'm seeing a couple themes in the chat. One of them, Michael Sheffman, you called out, is oftentimes stakeholders already think that they know the response, right? They know what the answer is going to be, which leads me into this next question for you, Layne. So tell us about a time when you applied design thinking. Like, what was the impact and what challenges did you run into?
Gosh, there's two people on this call who probably are going to know the example I'm referencing, but to that very point, at times, so at one point when I was leading a leadership development team, a set of stakeholders really believed they knew what the right solution was, and they said, hey, we just want you to design and develop this thing. And at the time, this was in the midst of the pandemic, and really kind of the early days, first couple of months of it, was to say, I can see why that solution may seem like a great idea, but let's actually talk to some of these leaders before we jump to solution. Let's really get clear on this particular moment in time. What are they feeling? What are they needing? Where do they feel under-resourced in terms of like their own capability? And how do we focus on that? And that does take time, right? And so the initial kind of pushback was, we don't have time for that. I told you what the answer is, go do the thing. And personally for me, I think sometimes in the face of that pushback, like it's really important to me to kind of reground in like, here's the user, here's the people we're doing this thing for. And so, the answer at that point in time was to say, let's put that on the shelf. We just want permission to talk to 10 people, and unfortunately at the time in the organization I worked in, it was a matter of like needing to get a little bit of permission. I think that's sometimes a challenge where there's a lot of gatekeeping sometimes to talk to who those end users are. We went and talked to 10 people, and what we did find was that what was needed most by that audience was really something quite different. And so it was useful and compelling to have, quotable quotes, if you will, and storytelling moments to say, here's what this group of people have told us is their biggest challenge as leaders. Here's what we recommend focusing on as a result of that, and really kind of building buy-in in that process throughout to say, we want to focus on this problem. Here's our approach. Here's how we will continue to validate this throughout the entire design cycle to make sure that we're not missing an opportunity to focus on what these people are telling us they need. The great news was it ended up being a really successful learning moment for a set of leaders who, were leading for the first time during such a enormous sort of global crisis, but also really were needing to kind of refill their own cup and put their oxygen mask on. They were experiencing burnout and frustration and really not knowing how they were going to get from one day to the next. And so for me, it's an example I think about a lot because it was such a powerful moment of remembering and being able to then deliver something that truly met people where they were at versus what a group of stakeholders might have perceived the need to be.
It's such a powerful example, Layne. Were you able to test and iterate the solution? So you talked to the 10, came up with something. Yeah. Were you able to go back to them?
Yeah, we went back to them instead of testing the whole solution. Essentially, it was a 90-minute learning experience that we ended up delivering. But we weren't able to test that full 90 minutes. What we were able to test initially was just actually 2 of the activities that were a component of the final experience. It was a highly experiential session that was really activity driven. And so we needed to make sure that, like, if we're going to invest this much of the time we have with this group, these activities have to land. One of the activities landed, one of the activities really didn't. So to my comment earlier about, kind of finding the joy in being wrong, it was like, okay, cool. I'm so glad it actually bombed right now. We have time to now build out a different activity and then be able to make sure that we're making sure that this content is resonating. And so we were able to do that. Those 2 activities, took up, if I think about the overall 90 minutes, those 2 activities probably took up about 35 to 40 minutes of the overall experience. So in that particular time frame, knowing that, leaders were really time pressured with everything happening pandemic wise, it was I would call that a success in that moment, even though we couldn't test the full thing.
Love it.
Thanks, Layne.
You've referenced a couple of things already that tie into the next question. One was about regrounding yourself into the audience and what they need. It's that deep empathy part of design thinking. And also managing the perceived need, those assumptions and cognitive bias that come into the sponsors and stakeholders' mindset. So if you really wanted to help us all to improve our ability to be empaths, deeply connected to the audience, how can we become more aware of what really is going on for them and have that empathy and wear that white belt that we talked about earlier, the beginner's mindset?
Yeah, a few things come to mind for me. One is, I think for me, it's always been useful to fall in love with in my case, fall in love with the audience. Whether that's leaders, maybe it's individual contributors, it honestly doesn't matter. I think this also applies for me in leading teams from a place of empathy, which is like falling in love with the folks that you're there to serve. And I think in a business context, sometimes that sounds maybe a little bit unusual, but I truly mean that, where it's falling in love with the humanity of the folks who are going to be interacting with whatever the thing is that myself or my team might be building, is a useful place to start. And then really doing, there's some really practical activities from a design thinking approach. I love to use empathy maps, which, is literally, drawing a big head on a flip chart and saying, what is this user, this audience member, what are they thinking, what are they hearing, what are they seeing, what are they saying, how are they feeling, getting as much as you can an ability to walk within their shoes by interviewing folks, doing focus groups, asking some really open-ended, curious questions, not to answer the questions you already think but to answer the questions that you really have no idea about. Those are some useful places usually that I try to start.
Lovely. Thank you.
And I'm just going to shout out Patrick's comment in the chat too. 100%. I can't agree more. This idea of, I would also say this applies to just, life in general these days, which is I've approached moments or relationships in work or outside where it's like, gosh, this person's really annoying me. Like, what's going on with that? And finding the thing to fall in love with, but also recognizing like that doesn't mean that I have to like this person, but we all share a common humanity. And if I can kind of find my way into that, that helps me be much more empathetic.
Layne, here's what I'm curious about. Like, you've been on your own journey with human-centered design. What are some mistakes you made with it early on that you now like recognize those pitfalls and avoid them?
Yeah, early on, I was more attached to, I'll say, certainly there's a rigor and a discipline around the process of applying human-centered design. And I would say, early on, as I was still building my own confidence, leading creative teams, leading teams that were using this work, I often was probably a little bit too much focused on like the rigor of the steps. And not to say that, that's not important, but to say, I think as I've matured my leadership capability, it's also been knowing when to hold that a little bit lightly when to recognize that, you know, there's creative ways to achieve each of the outcomes required at each step. So whether that's research or concepting or prototyping, there's the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. And I think as I've kind of grown in this space, it's being more comfortable with the spirit of the law at times, particularly within, you know, different organizational contexts or depending on what the product or program is you're trying to develop. That's helped me also really then empower the teams I lead to, you know, do it the way that works best for them while we're maintaining the spirit of the law, but not getting always quite so hung up on, you know, checking the box, let's say, of the process itself.
I love that. Before I hand back to Mark, like, it connects nicely to what Judith just put in the chat around knowing that people are experts in their own experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. It brings up this phrase in my head that often floats through it, which is, you know, holding people as able. You know, recognizing that, like, when we ask folks what they need, they will tell us. When we trust that they do know what they need, when we trust that everyone is the expert on their experience, it's such a richer conversation.
It's beautifully put. And I'm going to build on Patrick's question and add it into the chat here. This research that Nick Petrie's been doing around sustain, grow, and perform. And in particular, OD and talent professionals are saying we've been designing these really cool interventions that are supporting our leaders to help them with the craziness of COVID and the pandemic and the stuff that they're dealing with. And they're not showing for stuff. What's going on? So Nick did that. Let's find out from the leaders what's really going on for them. And what was going on for them was that they were really keen to access it and to grow, but the organization required that they perform right here, right now. In fact, so much so that they were digging into their reserves in order to maintain their performance. And so even with the best will to design something meaningful, sometimes the environment context doesn't support the very thing you're doing. Any thoughts about how to create meaningful interventions at the time in the way that will support leaders when they're facing that performance dilemma of just needing to get stuff done?
Yeah, I think, boy, I'm willing to bet people on this call have some ideas too. So please feel free to throw into the chat what's resonating for you. I think one of the things that certainly I've been faced with that myself is recognizing that in many cases we might have this beautiful vision of what the right thing can be, and it's not to say that those aren't things we should hold forth, but you know, oftentimes where it's been helpful is to say, like, let's try to focus on getting something in these leaders' hands versus maybe that idealized version, and really getting clear on, like, okay, are we talking about a 50% improvement? Probably not. What might it look like for leaders to have 10% more capacity, or to have a 10% or a 5% or a 3% improvement? And just in that way, be able to deliver at velocity, but also be realistic about how much this intervention is going to drive a real performance change, given all the constraints you were talking about, Mark. Like, yeah.
Beautiful. And Corey, I know you've got another couple of questions up your sleeve, but just before I flick over, just added a Menti poll question. Kind of let's go live with the audience to find out from our own lived experience designing meaningfully, what are some of the top tips, secret success factors that you find work for designing really meaningful solutions? So I'm going to pop it back into present mode. Feel free to add in as best you can. You'll need to be succinct. Unfortunately, Menti does limit the amount of words that we can use. So a research paper at this point won't work, but just some key phrases will. I'm going to take a guess that the relationship and tikanga. Robbie, was that you by any chance? Just keen to hear just some of the Maori terms that are coming through and how they play into the design being so important.
Yeah, tikanga, especially being for HCD, grounding it in that human place. Like personally, I don't view that tikanga is specifically a Māori or a ethnic or a First Nations concept. But it doesn't have to be te reo. It's actually about how we engage with people and who they are, where they are, and what bounds them. So by actually taking that sort of approach, and we're lucky in Aotearoa that we can actually point to Māori and say, well, what is the Māori perspective? But that brings out an HCD perspective, because you're looking at humans and understanding how they perceive it, and you're having to stop yourself from corporatizing that view. Is my perspective.
Yeah, thank you, mate. Other thoughts, reflections, Corey, Layne, as you see the great insights coming here into the Menti poll around how to do meaningful human-centered design?
I would say, I think, oh, sorry, Corey. I was going to say, I think what I'm really appreciating, and I think this, I had some notes written down before this conversation too, like, words like curiosity and trust and listening, acknowledgement. I mean, really deeply, I'm going to say kind of like ways of being as much as they are skills. And I think there's something about this work that's really this blend of, certainly there's capabilities and the ability to kind of engage in the practices, but then there's also a way of like individually and collectively being in the process of human-centered design that I see come through in these responses. So feels very holistic, and I'm appreciating that.
The thing that stands out to me is trust in the very middle. And Layne, it ties back to something you said earlier about just assuming that people are creative, capable, and whole. Just trusting that if you invite them in, you're going to end up with a better product. Yeah. All right, Mark, I have another question, but do you have another Menti, or can I?
No, that's me done on
okay.
Menti. Back with you.
Okay, and we're starting to see amazing questions pop up in the chat. Please continue, because Mark and I have another couple. Then we're going to open it to you and find out what questions you want to ask Layne. But Layne, you referenced something at the beginning of our time together about the intersection of human-centered design and the way you lead your teams. I'd love to know, how do you apply that concept to leadership?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think it's something that's been over the last couple of years a bit of a light bulb moment for me, honestly, which was, in the service of doing the work, myself and my teams, we've often focused on using human-centered processes to, let's say, develop a program. And what I recognize is that by using that as a way to accomplish the work, it was also changing how I led. And it wasn't, unfortunately, it wasn't like with great intention on my part that initially I was like, oh, I'm intentionally building these practices into how I lead. But as I was thinking about, where do I want to grow next and what does that look like? What I recognized was I was starting to lead differently, at first unintentionally, and then, bringing more intention to that to say, okay, there's certain non-negotiables for me as a leader. I stepped into a new role and I began leading a new team around this time that I was reflecting on this, where at the time, what I recognized was like, gosh, how much of the way I've been leading has been about what I think good leadership looks like, or maybe what, all of us have had exposure to. Instead, I said, there's only like a couple non-negotiables I really have when I'm leading a team. Everything else is really an opportunity to co-design with the team. So how am I engaging the team in questions like, how do we recognize, celebrate, honor each other's work? How do we collaborate? When, where, and how do we meet together? What's the purpose and intention of those meetings? What makes them useful or unuseful for us as a collective group? And that was, frankly, I think sometimes as a leader, there are moments when, the pressure of feeling like you do have to have all the answers can be a lot. And it was this moment where I was like, okay, I'm actually creating that for myself. No one around me is creating that expectation. How might I apply some of these lessons of human-centered design to co-creating my leadership with my team, and acknowledging that while I might have the, let's say, positional power through a title, I really desire every person on this team to feel empowered to co-create the environment that we want to be a part of.
What I love most about what you just said, Layne, was the piece around engaging the team in recognition. I think so often, and I've certainly fallen into this, I think we assume that people like to be recognized the way we ourselves like to be recognized versus bringing curiosity to that conversation.
I couldn't agree more. And as someone who doesn't love public recognition, I've also, I was like, probably some other folks feel that. I also think it was a moment to recognize that I might have to lean into something that's a bit less comfortable for me, because there are people who thrive in that. I don't love public recognition. I've also worked with folks who do, right? And so I think it's not just defaulting into the assumptions of like, everyone must like what I like when it comes to this specific thing.
Thanks, Layne.
I'm all good with my questions. I'd love to just open it up and see if anyone would like to unmute themselves and just dive into sharing a question with Layne to bring it to life.
Hi, can I jump in?
Of course, thank you.
I just put something in the chat and then you went jump in. I thought, well, I may as well save people reading. But I'm really curious with that, Layne, because I recognize I like recognition, but I'm not that comfortable with public recognition. So what kind of ways, I mean, even people in the group here tonight, or your morning, my evening, what other kind of ways have you found? Because it's a challenge in our business.
Yeah, I'd love to see other responses in chat as well. And, this is such a small example, but I've worked with folks who are like, hey, what means the most to me is like just the one-on-one conversation and helping me really understand like what specifically about what I did had a positive impact. I've also worked with some at times folks who are like and this kind of goes back to like this idea of like love languages, but like, hey, I really like sharing a meal with people. That feels really good to me. So if there's a chance to like have lunch together, grab a coffee together, that sort of opportunity just to almost like customize it. Financially, I think sometimes there's also a default in organizations of like, oh, let's give everyone, like, we're going to give folks a bonus for that work that they did. And I don't want to ever, say that doesn't matter. I think it does matter to some people, but sometimes it's actually the much simpler, just genuine, authentic, heartfelt thank yous that go a long way. Oh, Mark, thank you for the link to that tool. I'm going to be checking that out.
There's all of them apart from the somewhat un-PC in some places. Huge hugs for other places that are totally cool. So the tactile isn't there, but the other 4 of the love languages are reflected in that appreciation at work. Oh, other questions? Anyone else just comfortable to unmute and share, or uncomfortable and going to do it anyway, to unmute and share their question with Layne?
I'll hop in
Hi,
here.
Layne. I was asking if there's a reference tool on HCD that's your go-to.
Yeah, so there's there's many, but I will say a book that I personally have gotten so much from it's called Service Design Doing. And it's focused on designing services, but very much applies to products, very much applies to other types of deliverables or outputs you might be looking for. And there's just a tremendous amount of like creative activities and steps in there. And then I would say IDEO.org has the field guide to human-centered design that just similarly has a lot of like very practical tools, as well as kind of guides depending on the type of work that you're doing that are I've used with almost every team I've worked with at this point. because I find it's like a really accessible way to get into this work.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I've got a question for you, Layne. I just love to hear your thoughts around the intersection of customer experience or end user experience design thinking for products and then human-centered design. And I'm interested in what you believe are the benefits of when a business like is aligned to this thinking and they're committed to it funding wise, as well as, you know, how they prioritize or make decisions. And then if you've run into friction with that at times, particularly when the business is under pressure to perform or pay shareholders or whatever, and maybe how you've approached that.
Yeah, ironically, and there are a zillion different directions like I think that question could lead to. What I'll kind of share is, specific to my experience, which has been, I've been in a couple companies where that has been sort of I'm going to say table stakes when it comes to like consumer product development or developing products for an end user outside of the organization, but less commonly the way that the company or the organization has thought about it for internal products. So in two different organizations now, I've been able to be a champion of, hey, our ability to do this internally for our own employees, there is that direct relation to then how we are doing this with consumers, but it hasn't always been like perceived as like the value stream across both audiences, if you're thinking about it that way. The thing that's been interesting in that process when I think about things like leadership development products or programs has been the tension I've experienced is like there's skepticism of, what we've been doing works well enough. Why would we want to switch now? Why would we want to invest, time in needing to build a new capability around approaching it with human-centered design? Or why might we want to kind of walk away from things that we have certainly invested in an effort to, put those users in the center? And oftentimes what that has required is to say, we don't have to do anything differently. But if we center people in this way and really make sure that we're surfacing voices that often go unheard, how might we improve our outcomes? And, let's pilot, let's test, let's seek to do that for a period of time alongside running our existing products, knowing that there is, great commitment to those things already. How do we start to introduce this as another way for us to get closer to the end user? And in that process, sometimes that what I've seen is that tension starts to kind of shift, and it becomes, I guess the way I personally think about it is like you're opening up who gets a seat at the table to have a perspective on what they need. And so I think as that has happened and as stakeholders, senior leaders see the value of it, the support for approaching the work in this way just becomes much more explicit, and it's much easier to find executive sponsors to do that. So not a direct answer to what you're asking, Teresa, but just some observations.
Layne, Roland put a great question in chat. With AI's growing popularity and companies getting excited about it, how do you balance maintaining a strong human-centered approach, especially at a company like Google? And Roland, I don't know if you want to come off mute. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that question, but that was a great question.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. So Roland, I love this question. I think one thing, I'm sure many of you have also been seeing this, is AI, for me anyway, in this work will become a supporting tool. It will be an enhancement. It'll be a resource. But what it doesn't replace is actually going to talk to real humans in real time, in real spaces, and really understanding the challenges. And so, the way that in the work I've done at Google, the way that we've been doing that is to really look at those two things as complementary. It's to say, okay, we can really tap into AI for a lot of like data analysis, gleaning some of the insights maybe that are, being pulled from a variety of academic journals, et cetera. But the voices of the people that we're designing this thing for are really, we're going to give a little bit more, not a little bit, much more weight to that in designing in service of them, and really making sure that what it is we're creating feels like a personalized experience or program or resource. And we've also, in the process of kind of clarifying the design process we use, been really clear about the outcomes that we want human-centered design to drive. So we want it to be, I'll say outcomes / maybe guardrails is another way to think of it. It's, you know, our principles are around making sure we're developing things that are engaging, they're relevant, they're inclusive, they're outcomes based. So we're not designing, let's say, a learning product or experience just to engage, but it also has to be creating a specific outcome that we are going to measure and report back out to the business on. So those two things are working very much kind of hand in hand. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say the obvious, which is like, and I also think we're all learning our way into how AI is going to change the way we do this work. So that's the today answer, but I bet I'll have a different one in 2 weeks.
Appreciate that, Layne. And Shannon, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? It's really interesting. Volunteers leading volunteers. Or maybe she's not here. But the question, Layne, could you share some wisdom on designing leadership development for leaders who are volunteers leading volunteers, which is something they all do in their spare time?
Yeah. Shannon, if you're still on the line, absolutely, I'd love some context. But I think I guess the pieces I connect back to is really just the recognizing, like, regardless of sort of like the mission of the individual who's doing the thing. So in this case, volunteers leading volunteers is still leveraging those principles, still going to talk to them to understand, like, okay, what challenges, what pain points, where do you maybe not feel like you have the right capability or support to do the thing that you've been tasked with doing? And recognizing that there's a unique flavor in this. Volunteers leading volunteers, something they're doing in their spare time. My assumption is these are individuals who then are likely very time constrained, may not have a lot of time to invest in growing the skill that they might wish they had around it, et cetera. So, you know, being very practical and potentially taking a bite-sized approach, depending on what you learn through the research phase of the work, is most meaningful to these individuals. And if I'm missing some context, please feel free to add.
And a bit along that same line. Oh, Mark, do you want to go?
I was just probably going to share the same one, the question from Helen in the chat. Yeah.
Great. Any tips on HCD? Perfect. Yeah, this is, you know, one of the things that I'll say, you know, my current role, one of the things that we've been doing is really aligning our process with our product development process. I work in people development, aligning our process as well with principles around inclusive product design. And how do we really look at making sure that we are gaining insights from a variety of people. You know, everyone has a seat at this table, but oftentimes, you know, we all develop relationships in our organization, and we might have our go-tos, the people we go to over and over again to ask them, like, hey, do you want to be a part of a focus group? Can you take this survey? And so we've been really intentional to say, you know, we need to expand and broaden our pool. We also need to talk with people that maybe aren't the individuals who raise their hand to join a focus group or to complete the surveys or to participate in some action research. And so how do we really expand the scope of who we're looking to, and also look at different dimensions of, you know, diversity within this? So are we looking at people, you know, I'll say, Google is certainly a global company, but, you know, the majority of Googlers sit here in the US. And so oftentimes we might have overrepresentation of people who come from the US culture and not our folks from around the globe. How are we really stretching our muscles in terms of global representation and ensuring that we're not hearing the voices that we hear all the time? The other thing that, you know, sometimes can be a challenge or has been a challenge in some organizations is I mentioned earlier the word, kind of there's some gatekeeping sometimes around like who we can or can't talk to. And so it sometimes can be useful to kind of step back and just educate stakeholders or other, I'll say, invested parties on, it's also helpful to talk to folks who maybe are skeptics about this work, or maybe they're skeptics about this program. Maybe they're actually the people who've never come to a learning experience that we've designed. They have insights that we're going to learn from too. And so really kind of just helping everyone understand that, like, whether you're a user or not of this particular thing, we're going to find value in talking to a wider variety of folks to make sure that what we're designing is reflective of the environment that people are operating within.
That really resonates with me, Layne, particularly the piece about inviting skeptics in. I mean, oftentimes we, want to keep them at arm's length, but being able to invite them in and honestly hear like what their perspective is incredibly helpful. One set of questions I found that can be useful is to ask people like, what's negative about what we're proposing, what's interesting about it, and then what's positive or promising about it, to make sure that people have an opportunity, for instance, to share what's negative rather than feeling like I may not be able to, I might burn some relationships if I share negative ideas about what's being presented.
Yeah. I think about using some of those types of questions even in the go-to-market process, understanding like, gosh, we're only touching 10% of the intended audience for this product. Like, what's going wrong here? And really understanding from their perspective, like, so what's gotten in the way of you signing up to attend, or what's gotten in the way of you prioritizing or making time for this experience, has been useful for us to then also refine our go-to-market strategy to say, okay, like, they don't see themselves reflected in this work. How do we make sure that we are actually showcasing and highlighting how, this, I'll use a leadership development example, like this leadership development experience has been crafted specifically for this audience. Them knowing that is actually an attractor to wanting to sign up for it. And so just being able to kind of take some of those insights and use them for other purposes beyond just the program design.
That's so good. As we wrap up our time with you, Layne, it's gone by super fast, but would love to invite everyone to share in the chat two things. Number one, what's an insight you're taking away? And in line with our B3 or DIY methodology, walking away with what's an action you're going to take. Would love you to share an insight you're taking away and a potential action that you're considering after this time with Layne. If you could share in chat, we can inspire each other, learn from each other.
While we're waiting for folks to chat in, I'll also just say these questions that folks have shared are just so thoughtful and intriguing to me. So I know for myself, I'm going to walk away putting even more thought into some of these questions because they're really juicy. And it's thank you for engaging with the topic.
I like that, Michael.
Same.
Oh, Sheila. Yeah, ask to talk to 10 people. Oh, these are so good. As people are still putting those in, Mark, do you want to talk about what's coming next?
Yeah, for sure. I've got a couple of Menti slides just to share to bring it to life. And I've already referenced this for some of you, of course, earlier in the call around the research that Nick Petrie's been doing around grow, perform, sustain versus burnout. So we're just doing a bit of a market trial out in Europe and in the US and New Zealand at the moment. So anyone interested in doing the assessment, getting access to a digital debrief and a virtual debrief with the research and Nick Petrie, just PM me or send me an email. I've just put some details here into the chat so you can access that. It's free. We're just trying to do some design thinking and walk the talk with deep empathy, understand what works and what doesn't around that particular product set that will make a difference. So popping that into the chat. We've also got coming up a vertical incubator as part of our world tour. We were in the UK earlier this year. We were in Melbourne. We've been in the US, or currently are running the vertical incubator there. And now we're coming to Auckland as of October. So this is for anyone that wants to understand, deep dive on the principles of vertical development and how to design that into your experiences, of which design thinking is a part of creating the human-centered, then the research into how do we lift and shift leaders' capabilities to do so. This is how to go about designing experiences that leverage all the best of vertical development. There's also a mini-me version. So for those that aren't wanting to do the full deep dive, but want to understand the world of leadership development, the future of leadership development and what it means, we've popped in a one-day version that's aligned to the incubator, again in Auckland, that gives you a chance to experience what's coming up, both in terms of the power of artificial intelligence and leveraging technology to really scale your leadership development, but also, you know, what's new, what's coming up, what is the future of leadership development as we see it. And for this one, you can just email Roland with his email address there for further details. So that's it in terms of what's next. A couple of freebies, a couple of things that require a bit of investment, all good stuff. I'll hand back to yourself, Corey.
All right, Layne, we can't let you go without one final question, and it's this. We'd love you to leave us with just a moment of inspiration or levity. What advice, quote, or motto would you put on a billboard?
Oh my gosh, this is $1 million question. You know, to simplify it, you know, I would say it's finding joy. Like, so for me, this work is really joyful work. It's very fun, it's very playful, it's very creative. And something that I've been really drawn to lately is just this idea of, like, you know, what happens when more and more people can find the work that brings them joy and play. It doesn't have to be this work, certainly, but, like, you know, doing something that's joyful. And maybe it's not work, maybe it's some other part of your life. But I don't know, my word for 2023 has been find joy. And as I've been focused on that intention, it's been amazing to kind of see all of the different ways that that's come to life.
I love it so much. Thanks for being with us and sharing really inspirational and engaging, Layne.
Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Can't believe our time's up. Enjoy your day, everyone. Lovely to be here and host you all. Thank you again, Layne. Didn't quite get to touch that top, but one day.
Thanks, Mark. Take care.
Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora. Go well, everyone.